On May 30th, 1936, Louis Meyer sat above the bricks at Indianapolis, looking less like a man who had just made history than someone who had spent the afternoon being shaken, scorched, deafened, and exhausted by a racing machine. Around him, mechanics, officials, photographers, and spectators pressed toward car number 8. Meyer had started the Indianapolis 500 from 28th place, behind almost the entire field. 500 miles later, he had finished first. He lifted one hand and raised 3 fingers. In the other was a bottle of buttermilk. The gesture required no explanation to anyone who understood what had happened. Meyer had become the first driver to win the Indianapolis 500 3 times. The bottle would later become connected with one of the Speedway's most famous traditions. But the number 3 was the real story that afternoon. Nothing about Meyer's first appearance at Indianapolis had suggested such a future. 8 years earlier, he had not arrived as the obvious heir to American racing greatness. He had no pole position, no record-setting qualifying run, and for a time, he did not even have the car he expected to drive. His eventual place in history began in an era when automobile racing was still deciding what a racing car ought to be. American engineers were experimenting with engine layouts, supercharging, front-wheel drive, chassis construction, fuels, and increasingly specialized components. Cars could be astonishingly fast and frustratingly fragile. Indianapolis magnified every weakness because the race lasted 200 laps and 500 miles, long enough for heat, vibration, lubrication trouble, broken gears, damaged bearings, failing tires, or a single poorly prepared component to undo months of work. For a driver, there was no insulation from these problems. He sat only inches from the engine, transmission, fuel, and moving mechanical parts. Changes in sound, vibration, steering effort, or throttle response could be warnings rather than inconveniences. Louis Meyer entered this world young, mechanically curious and already accustomed to working around automobiles. Born in Manhattan in 1904 and raised in a family in which mechanical work was familiar, he developed the practical understanding that racing in the 1920s demanded. He was not an engine designer in the sense of Harry Miller or Leo Goosen, and his later career should not be projected backward onto his youth. At this stage, Meyer wanted to race, yet he entered a sport in which drivers spent their lives beside mechanics and builders, and that proximity mattered. One of the most influential names surrounding American racing was Harry Miller. Miller's Los Angeles operation had become a center of advanced racing engineering. His machines combined beautifully constructed engines with specialized chassis, and by the middle of the decade, Miller cars had become fixtures at Indianapolis. The attraction was obvious. They could be remarkably quick from comparatively small engines, and Miller's organization pursued technical solutions that other builders studied closely. But even sophisticated machinery remained vulnerable once a 500-mile race began. Meyer's first participation in the Indianapolis 500 came in 1927, though his name was not among the official starters. He served as a relief driver for Wilbur Shaw, taking the wheel during the race under rules that allowed drivers to hand cars over to substitutes. It offered Meyer experience inside an event that was unlike an ordinary short race. Indianapolis was not simply longer. Its length changed the meaning of every decision. A driver who attacked too aggressively could use up a car before the final quarter of the contest. A car that felt perfect at the start might become difficult hours later. Meyer had now experienced the Speedway, but when preparations began for 1928, there was little reason to imagine he was about to win it. His intended Duesenberg ride disappeared when the car was reassigned. For a young driver still trying to establish himself, losing an Indianapolis car could mean losing an entire year's opportunity. The opening came through a different chain of circumstances. Phil Schaefer had a Miller available after an anticipated sponsorship arrangement did not develop as planned. Alden Sampson II, a sportsman and Meyer supporter, acquired the car. The transaction gave Meyer a place in the race, although it did not place him among the obvious favorites. Qualifying made that clear. Leon Duray produced one of the sensations of the month in a front-drive Miller, reaching speeds that immediately drew attention throughout the Speedway. Meyer qualified 13th. His average was respectable, but the difference between his position and the pole represented more than 12 cars. When the field started on May 30th, the headlines naturally belonged to the machines at the front. Meyer's opportunity would have to develop over time. That was exactly what happened. The 1928 Indianapolis 500 began eliminating contenders in ways no qualifying chart could predict. Engines overheated, superchargers failed, timing gears broke, other cars suffered transmission or bearing trouble. Duray, whose qualifying performance had made his machine the standard for outright speed, led much of the early contest, but eventually retired. Meyer remained. He did not dominate the afternoon or spend hours at the front. In fact, his path to victory was almost the opposite of the image later generations often associated with a champion. For most of the race, he was positioned near enough to take advantage without controlling the entire event. As the final stages approached, the field that had begun with faster qualifiers had been reshaped by distance. Meyer moved into the lead with 19 laps remaining. Those 19 laps were the only laps he led all day. They were enough. Lou Moore stayed close, forcing Meyer to complete the final miles without the luxury of a large advantage. After more than 5 hours of racing, Meyer crossed the finish line roughly 44 seconds ahead. At 23 years old, in his first official Indianapolis start, he had won the Indianapolis 500. The circumstances made the result particularly striking. He had lost his original ride before the race. The replacement car had become available through a late arrangement. He started from the middle of the grid. He did not lead until the closing portion of the afternoon. None of those details diminished the victory. They defined it. Meyer had taken an opportunity that might never have existed and carried it to the end of 500 miles. The result helped propel him toward the 1928 National Driving Championship, immediately raising his position in American racing. Yet one victory could not tell anyone what kind of career he would have. Indianapolis history was filled with drivers who had brilliant days that were never repeated. Meyer had shown that he could win when circumstances aligned and the car remained beneath him. Beginning in 1929, he would return to the same track under a completely different burden. He was no longer the young outsider who might surprise the field. He was the defending champion, and every competitor now knew exactly what he had already done. The number painted on Louis Meyer's car in 1929 made his new position impossible to miss. He returned to Indianapolis carrying number 1, the mark of the defending winner, and qualified 8th. A year earlier, he had begun 13th and spent most of the race outside the lead before taking control near the finish. This time, he became one of the dominant figures of the afternoon. Meyer led 65 laps, more than 3 times his total from the previous year, yet Victory Circle belonged to Ray Keech. Meyer finished second, several minutes behind. The contrast between the two races offered a sharp lesson without requiring any philosophy to explain it. In 1928, Meyer had led 19 laps and won. In 1929, he led 65 and lost. The season itself still confirmed that his first championship had not been an isolated success. Meyer captured the national driving title again in 1929, giving him consecutive championships before his 26th birthday. His racing life now extended well beyond a single annual appearance at Indianapolis. The American Championship calendar took drivers onto tracks with very different personalities, including dirt ovals and the immense wooden board tracks that had become temples of speed during the 1920s. Board track racing could be extraordinarily fast. Cars ran high on steep banking while the wooden surfaces themselves deteriorated under weather and use. Dirt races demanded different responses as grip changed and the track developed ruts. The driver who hoped to remain competitive across a season could not rely on one technique or one type of car behavior. Meyer accumulated experience in these environments while becoming increasingly familiar with the people who made championship racing function: car owners, engine specialists, machinists, riding mechanics, suppliers, and builders. Indianapolis remained the most visible test, and in 1930, Meyer returned with perhaps his strongest starting position yet. He qualified second, placing himself beside the fastest cars before the race had even begun. If grid position alone had indicated what would happen, Meyer appeared ready for another victory. Instead, Billy Arnold took command of the event with a performance that left little opportunity for anyone else. Meyer completed the full 500 miles, but finished 4th. Nothing dramatic had removed him. He had simply been beaten. The result mattered because it broadened his experience in a way a sequence of victories could not. He now knew what it was to start near the front, survive the entire distance, and still watch another competitor control the race. The next year would be far less forgiving. Meyer qualified 25th for the 1931 Indianapolis 500, well back in the field. His own race ended after only 28 laps when an oil leak forced the car out. Years of preparation could disappear in minutes, and Meyer's number fell rapidly down the standings. Under the rules of the period, however, a retired driver was not necessarily finished for the day. Myron Stevens had started another Miller associated with Jadson sponsorship, arranged through Dale Drake. After Meyer's car failed, he took over Stevens' machine as a relief driver. The car eventually finished 4th. Meyer's name, therefore, became attached to 2 very different experiences in the same afternoon. A primary entry ended almost immediately by mechanical trouble, followed by a long relief stint that carried another machine toward a strong result. Dale Drake's involvement was more significant than it appeared at the time. Drake came from a family connected with mechanical manufacturing and racing components. In 1931, he was part of the network surrounding Meyer, rather than a famous figure in his own right. Their paths would continue to cross because Indianapolis naturally brought together people who understood engines from different positions. Meyer felt their behavior from the cockpit. Drake worked closer to preparation, components, and mechanics. Neither could know what their partnership would eventually become, and no future business empire needs to be invented in their minds to make the connection meaningful. The documented relationship was already beginning. Their next Indianapolis effort produced one of the strangest machines Meyer ever drove. For 1932, Meyer entered a Miller built around a twin-engine concept with Dale Drake serving as his riding mechanic. Even among the experimental machinery of early American racing, the car stood apart. Two engines promised a theoretical advantage, but doubling major components also introduced additional complexity. The machine qualified 7th, suggesting that the idea possessed genuine speed. On race day, however, ambition met the unforgiving reality of stressed metal. After 50 laps, a crankshaft failure ended Meyer's attempt. The twin-engine Miller had lasted only 1/4 of the race. There was no need to add a speech about the danger of complexity. The stationary car already made the point. A bold design could earn attention in the garage and still become irrelevant before the race reached halfway. Meyer had now gone from winning his first Indianapolis start to a sequence of results that covered almost every possible outcome. Second in 1929, fourth in 1930. An early retirement followed by a relief drive in 1931, another early retirement in 1932. The 4 years after his first victory did not follow the smooth ascent that later biographies can make a great career seem to possess. They were uneven, and that unevenness mattered. Every Indianapolis appearance required a new machine, a new set of circumstances, and another confrontation with problems that could not be solved by reputation. Meyer's 2 national championships demonstrated that he remained one of America's strongest drivers, but racing technology itself was shifting around him. Indianapolis regulations had changed at the beginning of the decade, opening the field to a broader range of cars and engine sizes in an effort to encourage more production-based participation. The elegant, purpose-built Millers of the 1920s remained influential, but the field became more varied. Builders adapted. Mechanics combined existing components with new chassis. Engines that had been designed under earlier rules were altered or replaced. This environment rewarded practical understanding rather than loyalty to a single design philosophy. Meyer's own cars reflected the experimentation. The twin-engine machine of 1932 was the most obvious example, but the larger story involved an industry trying to discover which combinations of power, durability, weight, fuel, and chassis behavior would succeed under changing regulations. Meyer did not need to become the designer of these systems to learn from them. He was living inside their consequences. The relationship with Dale Drake also deepened through work rather than dramatic declarations. Drake had already arranged sponsorship connected with Meyer in 1931 and ridden beside him in 1932. Their association continued because both remained active in a comparatively small racing world where trusted collaborators repeatedly found themselves working together. As preparations developed for the 1933 Indianapolis 500, Meyer was no longer dependent on the exact position he had occupied under Alden Sampson's ownership years earlier. The entry list carried an important change. Car number 36 was entered under Louis Meyer's own name. The young driver who had once needed a late purchase to secure a starting place was now entering machinery himself. He qualified 6th at nearly 117 miles per hour, close enough to the front to make him dangerous without becoming the spectacle of the month. 5 years had passed since his first victory. During that time, Meyer had won another national championship, lost Indianapolis after leading more laps than he had during his victory, completed 500 miles without reaching the podium, suffered an oil leak, driven relief in another man's car, and watched a crankshaft end one of the most unusual experiments he ever attempted. Nothing about those experiences guaranteed another win. They did, however, leave Meyer better acquainted with the difference between what a race promised at the start and what remained after 200 laps. When the cars rolled onto the grid in 1933, he faced a question that had followed every previous Indianapolis winner who returned to the Speedway. Was the first victory the defining afternoon of his career, or could it happen again? Louis Meyer did not have to wait until the final 19 laps to become visible in the 1933 Indianapolis 500. Starting 6th, he remained near the contest as the long afternoon unfolded and eventually moved into a position where the race could be controlled rather than merely survived. Bill Cummings, Fred Frame, Babe Stapp, and others spent time at or near the front, but the leadership changed as the miles accumulated. Meyer led 71 laps in total, including the closing portion that decided the result. When he completed the 200th lap, Wilbur Shaw was still racing behind him, but the gap was large enough that there was no final lap uncertainty. 5 years after arriving at Indianapolis as a first-time starter, Louis Meyer had won the Indianapolis 500 for the second time. Only Tommy Milton had previously achieved 2 victories. Meyer's season added another distinction. He captured the National Driving Championship for a third time, following his titles in 1928 and 1929. The result placed him among the leading drivers of his generation, but Indianapolis immediately resumed behaving like Indianapolis. In 1934, Meyer returned with a proven record and a car capable of qualifying 13th. 92 laps later, an oil tank problem stopped the entry. The 2-time winner was finished before reaching half distance. In 1935, he improved his starting position to 4th and completed all 500 miles, yet crossed the line 12th, while Kelly Patillo won from deep in the field. 2 seasons had passed since Meyer's second victory, and neither had resembled it. That uncertainty gave 1936 its significance. The idea of a third Indianapolis win existed because Meyer and Tommy Milton had reached 2, but no driver had ever reached 3. Meyer had nothing left to prove in the ordinary sense. He already possessed 3 national championships and 2 victories in America's most famous automobile race. A third would create a record that had never existed. Qualifying did not make that possibility look especially close. Meyer secured only 28th position in the 33-car field. When the cars lined up, 27 competitors stood between him and the front row. Rex Mays occupied pole position. Other leading drivers had the advantage of clear track when the race began, while Meyer entered the first turns, surrounded by traffic. Moving forward from that position required restraint as much as aggression. Every pass consumed space and exposed the car to risk, and there were hours of competition ahead. Meyer began advancing. The race changed leaders several times as the afternoon developed, with drivers such as Babe Stapp and Wilbur Shaw becoming prominent near the front. Meyer's own movement through the field gradually turned a poor starting position into an irrelevant statistic. By the time the contest entered its decisive stages, car number 8 was no longer chasing the race from the back. It was controlling it. Meyer ultimately led 96 laps, nearly half of the entire Indianapolis 500 and more than in either of his previous victories. Ted Horn emerged as his nearest challenger, but the 200th lap arrived with Meyer still ahead. His average speed exceeded 109 miles per hour, and the man who had started 28th had won. The 3 victories had come by 3 very different routes. In 1928, Meyer led only 19 laps after beginning 13th. In 1933, he started 6th and led 71. In 1936, he rose from 28th and led 96. The record, therefore, could not be reduced to one ideal starting position or one perfect tactical formula. Meyer had won when he needed to wait for an opportunity, when he could race near the front, and when he had to work through nearly the entire grid. In Victory Circle, the image from the beginning of his story was finally complete. Meyer, exhausted after 500 miles, raised 3 fingers while holding the bottle of buttermilk that would later become inseparable from Indianapolis tradition. This time, the number required no explanation. He was the first 3-time winner of the Indianapolis 500. The achievement could easily have served as the ending of a conventional racing biography. Meyer had reached a summit no driver before him had reached. But he was 31 years old, still active, and American racing continued moving around him. His connection with the sport was also beginning to expand beyond the simple question of where he finished behind the wheel. In 1937, Meyer returned as a driver and finished 4th. Another entry carrying his name, driven by Ralph Hepburn and powered by an Offenhauser engine, finished 2nd behind Wilbur Shaw. Meyer had not abandoned driving, yet the result offered an early glimpse of another role. He was becoming involved not only as the person controlling a car, but also as an entrant responsible for machinery raced by someone else. This distinction would become far more important later. For the moment, Meyer continued competing. His 1938 Indianapolis effort ended after an oil pump problem. In 1939, he produced one final serious challenge. Driving a Stevens chassis powered by a Winfield engine, Meyer qualified 2nd and led 79 laps. The race carried him almost to its conclusion before an accident ended his attempt at 197 laps, only 3 laps short of the scheduled distance. Wilbur Shaw won. Meyer was classified far down the final order, despite having spent a significant portion of the afternoon in front. It became his last Indianapolis 500 as a driver. He retired from active driving in 1939 with a record already sufficient to define a historic career: 3 Indianapolis victories and 3 national driving championships. The decision removed him from the cockpit, but not from the relationships that had accumulated around him. Dale Drake had remained part of that world. Drake had been connected to Meyer's racing through sponsorship, mechanical work, and pit crews, including service on the teams behind the 1933 and 1936 Indianapolis victories. Fred Offenhauser occupied another part of the same technical landscape. His name was becoming increasingly associated with a 4-cylinder racing engine rooted in the engineering tradition of Harry Miller's shop. Behind the drawings was Leo Goosen, one of the most important yet less publicly celebrated designers in American racing. These men represented different aspects of a system Meyer understood intimately without pretending to have created it. Miller and Goosen belonged to the world of design, Offenhauser to machining, development, and manufacture. Drake combined practical mechanical work with growing business experience. Meyer brought a driver's understanding of what happened after a carefully built engine left the shop and spent hours being punished on a racetrack. The relationships had not been created to serve a neat historical destiny. They had grown because American championship racing repeatedly brought the same specialists together. Then, the larger world intervened. After the United States entered the Second World War, Indianapolis racing stopped. The 500 would not be held from 1942 through 1945. Skilled machinists, materials industrial plants, and engineering attention were redirected toward wartime needs. The speedway, once filled every May with noise, fuel, and tens of thousands of spectators, fell silent. For Meyer, the interruption arrived after his driving career had already ended, creating a divide between the years in which he had become famous and the role he would assume afterward. When Indianapolis returned, Louis Meyer would no longer chase history from 28th place, 6th place, or any other position on the starting grid. His next competition would begin before the cars ever reached it. The engine business Louis Meyer eventually entered had a history that began long before his name appeared on its door. Harry Miller's Los Angeles shop had produced some of the most advanced American racing equipment of the 1920s, but Miller's reputation can obscure the collaborative nature of that work. Fred Offenhauser had joined the organization years earlier and became one of its key machinists and production figures. Leo Goosen arrived as a designer and created drawings for engines, whose influence reached far beyond a single racing season. When economic pressure and business difficulties overtook Miller's operation during the Depression, Offenhauser acquired the engine business in 1933. The transfer did not erase what had been learned. Tooling, experience, engineering knowledge, and the work of people such as Goosen continued under a new name. From that continuity emerged the four-cylinder racing engines that competitors came simply to call Offenhausers, or Offies. By the time Louis Meyer became involved, the engine was already established. He had not invented it. He had not drawn its original architecture, and treating him as its creator would erase the contributions of Miller, Offenhauser, Goosen, and others who had developed the design before him. Meyer's importance came later when he and Dale Drake became responsible for carrying that technology into a new period of American racing. The Offenhauser's appeal did not rest on an impressive cylinder count. 4 cylinders could sound modest beside larger multi-cylinder engines, but race engineering was not a contest in specification sheets. The Offie had been developed around the demands of competition, and Goosen produced important versions suited to the changing regulations of American championship racing. Its reputation came from the combination teams actually needed: power that could win and construction capable of enduring prolonged use. Engineers and mechanics also knew the engine well enough to continue adapting it. That accumulated knowledge was difficult for a completely new design to reproduce overnight. When racing stopped during the war, Offenhauser's operation survived the interruption, but Fred Offenhauser was approaching the point when he wanted to leave the business. Dale Drake represented the natural bridge to Louis Meyer. Their association was already more than a decade old. Drake had arranged racing sponsorship connected with Meyer, ridden beside him in the 1932 twin-engine Miller, and worked on crews during some of Meyer's greatest Indianapolis successes. He also possessed mechanical and manufacturing experience of his own. Meyer, meanwhile, had spent his adult life experiencing race engines from the opposite side of the equation. He knew how a promising car could become useless after 28 laps because oil escaped, how an ambitious two-engine concept could stop with a broken crankshaft, and how a machine that did not dominate qualifying could still carry a driver to victory circle. None of that transformed him into Leo Goosen. It gave him something else: the judgment of a customer who had spent years depending on the product. Around the end of the war, Meyer and Drake acquired the Offenhauser racing engine operation, establishing what became known as Meyer-Drake Engineering. Goosen continued contributing design work, preserving a technical connection that stretched back through Offenhauser to the Miller years. The arrangement was therefore less a sudden invention than a handover of responsibility. Meyer and Drake inherited an engine with a formidable reputation, experienced customers, specialized tooling, and decades of accumulated development. They also inherited a problem that every successful racing technology eventually faces: competitors do not agree to remain behind. The first job was not to preserve the Offie as a monument, it was to keep it relevant. Meyer's new daily world differed sharply from the one that had made him famous. As a driver, his work became visible the moment the green flag fell. Success or failure could be reduced to a finishing position. An engine shop operated far earlier in the chain of events. Parts had to be manufactured accurately. Assemblies had to be prepared for teams with different chassis and approaches. Problems discovered at one race needed to inform the next rebuild. Customers expected engines that could tolerate the demands they imposed on them, even though the company could not control how every mechanic installed or operated the unit. Meyer was no longer listening for trouble while sitting behind a steering wheel. He was helping create the conditions under which someone else might never hear that trouble at all. The return of the Indianapolis 500 in 1946 gave this new role its stage. Racing resumed in an America transformed by war. Industrial capability had expanded, technical expectations were changing. Yet the reopened speedway still contained a great deal of pre-war engineering knowledge. The first post-war Indianapolis 500 was not won by an Offenhauser. George Robson took the victory with Sparks Power, a useful reminder that Meyer and Drake had purchased a respected business rather than a guaranteed sequence of trophies. Competition resumed from zero. Every claim had to be demonstrated again on the track. During the months that followed, the Meyer-Drake operation continued preparing Offenhauser engines for customers. The underlying design benefited from familiarity, but familiarity alone did not explain why teams returned to it. Mechanics understood how to service the engine. Designers knew its strengths. Years of racing had exposed weaknesses that could be addressed rather than discovered for the first time. Goossen's engineering work continued providing development rather than mere repetition. The result was an engine ecosystem as much as a mechanical object. Design knowledge, machining practice, replacement parts, experience, and a network of people who knew how to make the power plant function within different cars. Meyer understood the value of this system because his driving career had depended on comparable networks. No Indianapolis victory had belonged only to him. Mechanics prepared the cars, owners funded them, designers created the machinery, and crews kept the effort alive. As an engine businessman, he now occupied one piece of the same structure. That position also changed the scale of his influence. During his driving years, Meyer could enter one primary car and perhaps, under the rules of an earlier era, take over another as a relief driver. Meyer-Drake engines could appear in multiple cars at once. A single race might therefore contain several opportunities for the shop's work to succeed or fail. Each engine left the company and entered a different environment. Some teams would qualify well, others would struggle. A driver could crash a perfectly healthy machine. A component elsewhere in the car could end the afternoon. Engine preparation had to be judged over many results rather than one. This broader perspective suited Meyer's practical understanding of competition. He had spent enough years losing races for reasons that had nothing to do with his reputation to know that technical dominance was never permanent. The post-war Indianapolis field was moving toward specialized roadsters, chassis innovations, and increasingly professional preparation. A proven engine could become the center of those developments only by adapting alongside them. In 1947, the first major test arrived. Maury Rose qualified a Dite-built Blue Crown spark plug special powered by an Offenhauser prepared through the Meyer-Drake operation. Rose already knew Indianapolis pressure, and the car represented the kind of partnership on which Meyer's new career would depend. Chassis builder, team, driver, and engine specialists contributing different elements to one machine. The race began. Meyer was no longer strapped into a cockpit, unable to escape the heat and vibration until the car stopped. He could watch the progress of machinery from outside it, but that did not make the result less personal. Somewhere inside Rose's car, thousands of moving and combusting events were repeating under a load that would continue for 500 miles if everything worked. When the Blue Crown Special reached the finish first, Louis Meyer had returned to Indianapolis Victory Circle without completing a single lap himself. One engine-powered victory did not yet constitute a dynasty, but the following May would reveal whether 1947 had been a successful return or the beginning of something much larger. Maury Rose came back to Indianapolis in 1948 and won again. The Blue Crown Special, once more powered by a Meyer-Drake Offenhauser, gave the operation a second consecutive victory. In 1949, Bill Holland made it 3. The sequence had moved beyond coincidence, but no one standing in those early post-war garages could simply assume how far it would continue. Every new May introduced different cars, changing competitors, fresh mechanical problems, and drivers determined to break whatever pattern had been established the year before. The Offenhauser kept returning to the front. Through the 1950s, American Indianapolis racing evolved around increasingly specialized roadsters. Chassis builders such as Frank Curtis and A.J. Watson refined cars specifically for the speedway's demands. Engines were positioned and packaged to improve weight distribution. Drivers sat lower and offset within machines that looked very different from those Meyer had driven to victory in the late 1920s. The engineering surrounding the Offie changed, yet the engine remained an extraordinarily persistent part of the winning combination. Bill Vukovich used Offenhauser power to win consecutively in 1953 and 1954. Roger Ward carried the lineage to Victory Circle later in the decade and again in the early 1960s. Parnelli Jones won from pole in 1963. A.J. Foyt followed in 1964. Between Maury Rose's victory in 1947 and Foyt's in 1964, every winning Indianapolis 500 car used an Offenhauser from the Meyer-Drake operation. 18 races. 18 consecutive victories. The number communicated more than a long list of names could. Meyer had needed 8 years to accumulate his 3 personal Indianapolis wins. The company he and Drake operated became part of every winning combination for nearly 2 decades. The streak should not be mistaken for proof that an Offie engine automatically guaranteed victory. Many Offenhauser-powered cars lost during the same years. Drivers made errors, components outside the engine failed, teams prepared cars differently, and competitors using the same basic power plant still had to defeat one another. That actually made the engine's position more significant. It was not dominating because one privileged team possessed a secret nobody else could buy. It became the foundation around which many of the strongest entrants built their efforts. Chassis designers learned how to package it. Mechanics became deeply familiar with its needs. Experienced specialists refined preparation practices from one season to the next. Leo Goosen remained part of that engineering continuity, ensuring that the design did not simply survive by standing still. Development continued as fuels, rules, chassis, and power requirements changed. The familiar four-cylinder form concealed decades of revision. Louis Meyer occupied this system less as a celebrity than as part of its operating structure. His fame naturally connected the company to the man who had won Indianapolis 3 times, but the engine business required different habits from those that had produced applause in Victory Circle. Customers needed support. Engines needed rebuilding. Parts had to be made consistently. Results from the track had to return to the shop as practical information. Dale Drake brought his own technical and manufacturing experience, and the enterprise depended on specialists, whose names were far less recognizable to spectators than Meyer's. The contrast was fitting. Meyer's first career had made him visible because the driver sat alone in the racing car when it crossed the finish line. His second career taught the opposite lesson. By the time a winning engine reached the final lap, the work of many people had already disappeared inside it. The Meyer family connection to that work deepened through Louis "Sonny" Meyer Jr. Sonny entered the engine business and developed into an accomplished racing engine specialist in his own right. He worked on Indianapolis efforts, became a chief mechanic, and eventually built a career associated with numerous winning engines. The transition from father to son illustrated how much the Meyer name had shifted since 1928. Louis Meyer had become known by controlling a car. Sonny became known within racing by preparing what others controlled. By the beginning of the 1960s, however, a larger technical change was approaching. Indianapolis had spent decades dominated by front-engine cars, whose proportions seemed almost inseparable from American championship racing. Rear-engine designs began challenging that assumption. European constructors demonstrated different approaches to chassis layout, and major manufacturers recognized Indianapolis as a stage on which modern engineering could be advertised to an enormous audience. Ford's growing involvement became particularly important. The rear-engine Lotus entries showed that the old arrangement could be attacked not merely with another version of the same roadster, but with a fundamentally different package. The Offenhauser did not vanish when these challengers appeared. Parnelli Jones still won in 1963, and A.J. Foyt's 1964 victory extended the Meyer-Drake sequence to 18. Yet the momentum of design was shifting. In 1965, Jim Clark drove a rear-engine Lotus powered by Ford to victory, ending the uninterrupted Offenhauser run. For the first time since George Robson's post-war win in 1946, the Indianapolis winner did not depend on the Meyer-Drake Offie. The change might have offered an easy ending to Meyer's story. The old champion and his old engine displaced by a new era. His actual career refused to fit that sentimental pattern. Around the same period, Meyer sold his interest in Meyer-Drake to Dale Drake and became involved in the distribution of Ford racing engines. Instead of spending his later years defending a technical world that was disappearing, he became connected to the technology helping replace it. The choice echoed the adaptability that had defined his racing career. Meyer's first Indianapolis victory had begun only after his expected car was taken away and another became available. His career had survived failed experiments, changing regulations, mechanical retirements, and eventually the end of his time behind the wheel. Moving toward Ford power represented another transition rather than a betrayal of the past. Dale Drake continued with the Offenhauser operation, and the engine itself proved far more difficult to retire than the end of the 18-race streak suggested. Turbocharging transformed what the basic architecture could produce. Offenhauser engines returned to Indianapolis Victory Circle in 1968 and then captured the race every year from 1972 through 1976. Those later victories belonged to a technical environment dramatically different from the naturally aspirated roadster era, yet they remained connected to an engineering lineage stretching backward through Drake, Meyer, Offenhauser, Goosen, and Miller. Few racing technologies have demonstrated their history so visibly. The same broad family of engines that grew from pre-war American design practice survived long enough to compete in the age of turbocharging and rear-engine cars. Louis Meyer's place within that lineage is strongest when nothing is exaggerated. He did not invent the Offenhauser. He did not personally design every successful version. He did not single-handedly produce 18 consecutive Indianapolis victories, and neither he nor any other individual could have done so. His historical distinction is more interesting than the myth would be. Meyer first learned Indianapolis from inside the car. He arrived as a young driver whose opportunity in 1928 existed only because another machine became available. He led 19 laps and won. 5 years later, he returned to Victory Circle. In 1936, he started 28th and became the first driver in history to win the Indianapolis 500 3 times. When his driving career ended, he carried decades of practical racing judgment into a partnership with Dale Drake and assumed responsibility for an engine business built by engineers and machinists before him. Under Meyer-Drake, Offenhauser-powered cars then won every Indianapolis 500 from 1947 through 1964. The two achievements belong together not because Meyer transformed magically from racer into inventor, but because both careers existed inside the same demanding system. Indianapolis rewarded people who could adapt. The machine could change. The rules could change. Even the position from which a man influenced the race could change completely. The photograph from 1936 therefore captures only half of Louis Meyer's story. He is seated in victory circle, physically drained, holding a bottle of buttermilk and raising 3 fingers to mark an achievement nobody before him had reached. At that moment, the most important machine in his career appeared to be the car beneath him. Years later, Meyer could stand outside the cockpit and watch other drivers reach the same place with engines supplied by the company he helped lead. Eventually, those engines would lose their dominance, just as every racing technology does. Rear engine cars would replace the roadsters. Ford would end the Offenhauser streak. Turbocharging would give the old engine a new life before another generation finally moved beyond it. The names and machinery changed, but the pattern running through Meyer's career remained remarkably consistent. He never possessed complete control over Indianapolis because nobody ever has. He succeeded by understanding the part he could control, adapting when circumstances took something away, and working within the larger machinery of people and engineering that made victory possible. Louis Meyer entered Indianapolis history with his hands on a steering wheel. He remained there long after he stopped driving, when the sound of engines connected to his name continued echoing across the same 2.5 miles of bricks and asphalt where his own unlikely journey had begun.